Okay, welcome everyone. Great to have you here today. There's a lot of you online, and it's hopefully going to be a great discussion of how the science and policy interface can be, dare I say it, more serviceable, even though I think we've come a long way in the last decade or so. But first, let us make an acknowledgement of country. It's doubly fitting here, I think, as our first Australians have a huge stake and role in a better interface in the water sector and increasingly more widely. So, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live. For many of us here, it's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I also wish to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'm just going to remind you about what we're discussing today. Some of you will have seen the blurb on the website, but it's about what will science and technology be like in 30 years? How might policy making be different? When you bring the two together, will the interface between science and policy be different? And through that lens of the policy-science interface, our speakers will offer their ideas on changes that need to happen soon. The speakers will be in conversation with me, but of course, we'll be endeavouring to answer questions that come from you in the chat line. So now I'd like to just give a little brief overview of our highly credentialed speakers. Deborah Peterson is currently a visiting fellow at the ANU, but she has over 25 years experience in the public sector as a senior executive. She's led economic research, regulatory reviews and national inquiries, and policy and strategy development and implementation across a wide range of sectors and issues. So Deb's worked with international, state and federal agencies and research institutes. Catherine Daniels, a professor and transdisciplinary academic in the ANU Institute for Water Futures. She's also Interim Associate Dean, College of Engineering and Computer Science, research lead at 3A Institute and professor at the ANU's Fenner School. Philip Glyde is Chief Executive of the MurrayDarling Basin Authority since 2016. He's Deputy Secretary in the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources before that. And we had a large range of responsibilities: agriculture, fisheries, forestry policy, international trade, market access, and also looked after the Agriculture Bureau of the Australian Bureau, I should say, of Agriculture and Source Economics. Paul Tregoning is Professor and Head of the Geodesy Group at the ANU's Research School of Earth Sciences and is an in-space mission specialist, a geophysicist who uses satellite data to study changes occurring on Earth as a result of many different geophysical processes. So that's a very, very highly credentialed panel. And what I thought I might do next, though, is just give a brief definition of the science policy interface before we turn over to our speakers. Here I'm quoting from Van der Herve, an article coming out of Futures in 2007. So that science policy interface has been defined as social processes which encompass relations between scientists and other actors in the policy process, and which ideally allow for exchanges, co-evolution and joint construction of knowledge with the aim of enriching decision making. So that's slightly perhaps a science perspective, but that's the definition in the scientific literature. And how does and should the science policy interface operate? And there's a lot of discussion in the literature about this. Obviously not as a science push model, which tends to overemphasize the pursuit of pure knowledge rather than knowledge applicability. And it may lack focus, of course, on the complex issues. There's also the policy pool model, where science is used to provide solutions or support evidence for policy. Sometimes it's not feasible for science provides those sorts of solutions due to limited data, but probably also mainly the capacity of researchers. So science and policy co-production is the model that is now promoted to balance the limitations of the other two models. So with that little background, let me pass over now to the panel for their pearls of wisdom. And the order will be Deb, Paul, Philip and Catherine. So Deb, can I please hand over to you to give us your ideas? Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. I found this task of looking to what could be in 2050 extremely challenging. Nothing's more certain than uncertainty. And as you'll see, I've chosen to take quite an optimistic stance today, but I just want to be clear that what I'm saying aren't forecast. One could also write a more pessimistic view, but today I'm going to be really positive. We know demands on water are increasing and water availability is decreasing. Most climate change models suggest the basin's climate will become drier and more variable, more extreme droughts, especially in the southern basin. So it's not surprising that tensions are and have been high, and there's intense and heated debate about how water has been allocated and how it's being managed. This is a really huge, complex area, and I'm just going to touch on 4 ways in which 2050 could be different today. And in doing so, I'm going to draw on some of the findings from an independent review panel that I was recently a member of, where we were asked to assess social and economic conditions in the basin. So now looking forward to 2050, which was the task given to me, how might things be different? Well, let's say first that we greatly improved our understanding of the benefits of environmental watering. But I would add, I have to add, there's still going to be a lot more to understand. So in 2020, there was an MDBA submission to the Productivity Commission, and they really highlighted the need for better information. They said, lack of relevant information means government cannot effectively describe the conditions of the basin and the contributions of the water management framework that it's made to the environment and to basin communities and economies. And they highlighted that the lack of information has left a real vacuum in the public domain, which then gets filled with misinformation, misperceptions, or misappropriation of available information. And this contributes to erosion of trust, which I'll come to later. So while by 2020, a vast amount of information had been collected about basin conditions, we're still struggling with data that's fragmented, that's disconnected across state boundaries, and often it's difficult to access and locate. There's time lags in being able to report on water use and outcomes, particularly in terms of environmental water use. And many reviews point to an urgent need to improve confidence in the cost of environmental water recovery to rural and regional communities and convince them that it's all worthwhile. So in the 30 years since then, governments agreed on a framework to track environmental outcomes and how these basin communities and how these affect basin communities' social and economic well-being. This is well resourced with long-term funding and with governance arrangements that deliver confidence in the information and analysis being provided. We created a learning culture that supports questioning, admitting of and learning from mistakes and innovation. Science reasserted its importance, and we have strong research capabilities in Australia while also keeping an eye out for good ideas. If someone's doing it better elsewhere, we adapt these findings to our circumstances. We don't just sit back and say, hey, we're the best. Second, by 2050, we've addressed major gaps in information about social and economic conditions in the basin, and I think this is really important. When as a review panel, we sought to understand the conditions of basin communities, we found really big data gaps. Among other things, there was almost no information about aspirations, visions, and objectives of basin communities or the challenges that they were experiencing. There were big gaps in availability on basin-wide social conditions. There was a need for a synthesis of economic and social conditions to improve understanding of well-being and resilience. We needed more effort to examine the whole community rather than only some parts of it. And there were calls for collaborative and participatory approaches, but there were only a few studies that were exploring the implementation and outcomes of collaborative governance in basin communities. And our panel's inquiry also highlighted big gaps in information about First Nation communities. And First Nation groups emphasized to us the need for greater effort to build knowledge and improve understanding. And they called for those efforts to be led by First Nations in a culturally acceptable way with appropriate support. So soon after 2020, basin state governments accelerated development of a comprehensive framework for evaluating basin water reforms on social and economic conditions, and it moved to rolling reporting. Some of the changes included a much closer and deeper engagement with Indigenous communities to better understand their aspirations, and to provide resources for First Nation groups to track social and economic conditions. This data is easily available, publicly accessible, and it's widely used. It supports understanding and discussion about distributional consequences of reform and the pace of change, which is really important to be able to underpin policy. Third, we worked hard to rebuild trust by improving transparency and communication, among other things. Despite repeated commitments and substantial efforts to improve transparency and information sharing in the early 2000s, many stakeholder groups continue to report that trust in governments was low. And among other things, we needed to have a constructive dialogue and information relevant to people's circumstances. People needed to be able to see themselves in the data. Communities and individuals needed to be able to relate to the information so that they'd have confidence that governments really understood local impacts and took those into account in their decision making. So moving to 2050, governments reconsidered the way information is shared. The focus became less about providing information about what the government is doing to providing information about what really matters to those that are affected by changes. Data is at a much finer scale, allowing understanding about what lies beneath those averages. Governments invested in easily accessible basin-wide water resource information platforms that provide timely information, and these allow all water users to improve how they manage their risk, facilitates well-functioning markets and the use of environmental water, and supports dialogue about changes needed in the future. And the fourth area that I wanted to touch on related to trust also is that diverse views are sought, respectfully heard, and reflected on, and are used in decision-making. And what this is about was, in the course of our socioeconomic review, and also in other reviews, we heard countless calls that communities wanted to be at the center of reform, to have a seat at the table, to be at the heart of decisions deciding their future. So interests in the techniques of participatory and deliberative democracy grew rapidly in the mid-2020s, and research developed in the context of the basin. And difficult questions were asked and began to be answered. Which communities? And what's a community anyways? Which people in those communities, and how would they be selected? What process for what types of issues? What kind of input? Who would provide support for these deliberation processes? How would quiet voices of minority groups be included? Who would have decision-making rights? How would these kind of approaches sit alongside existing governance arrangements? So by trialing and testing different approaches, basin governments and communities found better ways to engage about basin and broader reforms, strengthen leadership capacity of regional communities and government agencies. So just in conclusion, there's nothing more certain and unchanging than uncertainty and change. Dynamic change will be something that we're going to need to better understand, and we will be better at talking about that because we will have had a longer lens to look at. But better information doesn't avoid the need for really robust decision-making processes and institutions, and it won't avoid the hard yards of making difficult trade-offs. So as pressure comes on the water resource, and it will come even more so in the future, we rapidly need to get better at these conversations and how we make decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deb, for that very comprehensive overview. A lot of detail there, and I'm sure some of those points will keep coming up. May I now turn over to Paul, who's forewarned me that he's going to talk about certainly you can't manage what you can't measure is the theme, I think. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, that's a quote from the National Water Act of 2007, I think, where it said, you can't manage what you don't measure. I'm a geophysicist who uses satellites to measure changes on Earth. Behind me here, you can see an artist impression of the GRACE follow-on satellites, which are used to measure total water storage changes across the landscape. We can get this down to a spatial resolution of maybe 200 kilometers at this point, which is no good for a farmer yet, but advances will make this better and better in the future. Current satellite missions can be used to measure soil moisture in the top 10 centimeters or so, vegetation state. There are all sorts of hyperspectral measurements that can be taken to give information about crops and so on. The melding and assimilation of these satellite measurements into, or in conjunction with modeling, builds a system whereby much more can be learnt about the state of the environment. Where is the water? Is it in the top 10 centimeters? Is it changing at the root zone level? Groundwater aquifers depleting? And once we know this kind of information about where the water is and how it's changing, it can then be used to predict the vegetation state going forward up to 5 or 6 months into the future. So if I wind the clock forward and talk about what will happen into the future, I'll use Deborah's kind of way of talking as though we're already there. So back in 2018, the Australian Space Agency was established, which in the 2020 era, 2021, developed a whole series of roadmaps which laid out the path for how Australia could build a space industry. And that industry is now up and running, it's flourishing. It initially began using substantial government investment to build up the capability and the industries. And now we have a whole bunch of CubeSats, nanosats, big satellite missions. Australia is a real player in the Earth observing field, and we have an enormous amount of information that we didn't have back in 2020 about the state of the environment, where is the water, how much water is there. We know this information on a daily basis, and as Deborah said, it's all publicly available now. People can look up how much water is in a particular dam. Government agencies can track the environmental flows as they go down the river and can watch all the farms along the way to make sure they don't take water that they're not entitled to. The whole system is well monitored. The modelling matches the observations. There is no longer 20% water missing between the model and what's actually on the ground in the rivers. We understand our system much, much better, and that information is providing key knowledge which is informing policy. And so we have a much better regulatory environment and a much better agricultural system because we know more about what's actually in the landscape. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Paul. Now, let's now move on to Philip, who will talk from his own policy perspective. Thank you, Philip.
Thanks very much, Tony. And yeah, it's always good to follow Paul. I really like to live in the world that he described with that extra knowledge, because that is the key to it all. Could I just acknowledge the traditional owners of the Murray-Darling Basin, the 46 Aboriginal nations that comprise the basin, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and similarly pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the audience. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm a policy geek. I've been pursuing for the last 40 years from within government I've been trying to find that interface between policy and science. I've always been driven by trying to find how to get the science quickly enough to the policy makers and the decision makers in government. And I've tried to find the interface and I've worked on several sides of it, whether I'm in the Prime Minister's department, whether I'm in a line department providing advice through a minister to decision makers in cabinet, whether I'm in a technical agency like the MDBA or ABARES that was trying to take research and apply it to the problems of the day. It's so hard to get the timing right between getting the work done and the actual demand for it in the policy world. So I'm really intrigued by what it might, if I can't find it, if I haven't been able to find or make that work terribly well over the last 40 years, I'm a bit worried how I'm going to find it in 2050, but never mind. I'm approaching it from a slightly different way. I'm kind of hopeful that by 2050, we'll have addressed some of the real things that are just so much, they're holding back us getting to what we would like to see within the Murray-Darling Basin, which is a healthy working basin, but essentially a sustainable river system that's doing its best to provide values to all, not just to a selected few. And so in my world, in 2050, I'd like to think that we would have the climate change understood at a local level, that there'd be policy and practices in place, governments committed to doing work to mitigate the impacts, governments committed to work to adapting to the change that we're already experiencing. I'd like to see what is not the case. I'd like to see all of the policies and all of the science all connected up. Right at the moment, the Basin Plan's a blunt instrument. It does a lot of things, but primarily it's about the quantity of water running down rivers. But that's not enough. We need, we've been pursuing that quite strongly, and that's important and vital. But there's a whole lot of other policies that need to go along with it. Complementary natural resource management policies, socio and economic development policies. I won't go on in the interest of time, but there's so many more policies that need to be joined together. Similarly, science needs to be, and I'm using a very broad definition of science, there's a lot of things that are stopping the more rapid implementation and getting to that sustainable river system. But one of them is the fact that we've got lots of information on the environment, lots of information on hydrology, not enough, of course, but we don't have very much information on what's happening in communities and towns at a really local level. And I'll come back to that. But just one example, we don't have hardwired into our systems traditional knowledge from Indigenous nations. We don't have hardwired into our policy making the experiences of locals that have lived in the area for generations often. I think I'd like to think that the communities that are currently highly activated and they're actually at the table making their contribution, because at the moment I think most people, and Deb Peterson's panel that she mentioned earlier found this, that people don't like being told what to do from remote people in government or from remote experts in academic institutions. They want to be able to be part of that decision making, and we haven't been successful at doing that. I'd also like to think that the water wars will be over. The fact that every single aspect of the debate, whether it's the science, whether it's the policy response, whether it's the outcomes, we won't be arguing on the back of that. And it'll be like we are now. If you look back to the tariff debates and the quota debates that were so strong in the 60s and the 70s and 80s, we're way past that. It was a big change to move away from those for us to become the second least supported agricultural producing nation in the world after New Zealand. Wouldn't it be good if we're in that space where we're all on that one page? I'd like to think that, yeah, like getting rid of smoking or stopping drinking and driving, we're past that tense debate stage. But I'd like to think that in that sense, we've got really innovative ways along the lines that Paul's talking about, how we manage to adapt to a changed climate. All our policies and all our sciences are working together. The policies are going to be increasingly informed by First Nations knowledge and lived experiences, and we've regained trust. Governments and government agencies, the people who actually make the decisions about this community resource are actually trusted, because right at the moment, and certainly it's been the case over certainly during my career time, absolutely declining trust in governments and absolutely declining trust in expert institutions such as the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And I think with the democratisation of data, the fact that people don't want to be told that it'll all be okay. They want to know that they're going to get an outcome in their part of the basin, in their part of the river, in their industry, in their town, in whatever they're interested in. They don't want to know that it's going to be for the greater good of 1 million square kilometres. That was the thing that was missing, a plan that was oblivious to boundaries. But the reality is the decisions are being influenced by people because of their experiences at that local level. And how we deal with that, that getting the information out to people so they can participate in decisions, they can own the decisions, they can understand the decisions, and they can see the benefits as well as experience the cost of moving to a sustainable river system. But I'll stop there, Tony, and hand over to Catherine.
Yes, thank you very much, Phil, for that very refreshing and compelling view of how we might move to a healthy working basin. Yes, Catherine, I'm going to turn over to you now. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks Tony, and hello everyone. Can I also acknowledge that I'm on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, never ceded, always sacred, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I think when we're reflecting on the science policy interface in 2050, it's worth reflecting on the fact that the futures have been built here for tens of thousands of years. And in fact, our First Nations, our Indigenous peoples have had very fluid and effective science policy interfaces for many years, and a knowledge about how to connect first science and governance for action to manage countries sustainably over millennia. So I think as we think forward, it's worth reflecting that we can still learn and do a lot of things together and not lose all of those amazing ways of functioning. If we think forward, I think one of the challenges for us, we've had sort of very optimistic views so far, is thinking that the science policy interface has never been homogeneous across our continent. It ranges, and in fact, we tend to have a range of distributed and potentially competing futures that are always in play. Different groups have different ways of projecting forwards, and there are politics between those. And I think in 2050, nothing will have changed there, in that there will still be competing values and views in politics. But the way we organise them is something that we can think about. Now, we also see all sorts of underlying trends and uncertainties, and Deb spoke about uncertainties that may impact where we end up. And I think we have touched on a lot of these both today and in previous sessions, but the ones that I want to highlight are things like, to what extent will our science policy interfaces be managed in the future, in 2050, by humans, or will it rather be more by machines through analytics and automation? What kind of scales and levels of governance will we be preferencing for decision making? We heard about the community level, but will it also be a global level? Will we all have to be connected and moving things around the planet? Including the structuring of how we connect these different levels and who gets to decide on these. The other one is, how are we going to manage exposures to risks? So climate extreme events, system failures, and resource capture or sharing that are distributed and managed. And this is very much an issue about power, effective adaptation, and capacity for resilience. And then the last trend that I want to highlight, although there are many more, is around how we see rights and responsibilities, including how perspectives and legislation on water sovereignty, not just water sovereignty, also data sovereignty, will be enacted, and the levels of protection that may apply to individuals and communities. So I think there are a whole lot of alternative parts and underlying cultural values and preferences that we can think about, as well as a legacy of past decisions. 2050 will still be dealing with the infrastructure of today and the infrastructure that we'll be putting in place over the next 30 years. So I think if I had to make any kind of solid prediction, I think Deb's is probably the most sensible one, but if I had to make one, it would probably be that policy will be based on a lot more real-time and regular data from sensing technologies and autonomous decision-making systems than today. I think we will see a change there. We've seen computation change, and I think that will continue. However, who develops and controls these systems and develops the parameters for their deployment is, I think, still a really open question for different communities, different basins and different countries. So I just want to present to you very briefly two competing futures that I see out of this particular set, particularly focused on that kind of automation and governance side. I can imagine an option in 2050 where the Murray-Darling Basin will be open and transparent with its knowledge and data sharing, one that goes a bit to Deb and Philip and Paul's perspectives, where communities, governments, businesses and researchers work together for overall and coordinated benefits. In such a system, we would likely have open markets where a range of different policy analytics, so tools and methods to support policy decisions, can be developed, piloted and experimented with and evaluated, and then coordinated into overarching strategies for planning and basin improvements that would then help to develop a larger range of really fit for purpose tools across systems and communities because they range so significantly in values, beliefs, and the kinds of operational decision-making needs that they have. Within such a model as this of the science policy interface, I think there could be space for personalisation and still have a whole lot of human agency over our sort of water-related and data-related choices and the kinds of technologies and information supports that we actually choose to engage with. And these may include personal and environmental nano and eDNA tracing technologies, augmented and virtual reality, and the kinds of support networks that we want. And I think if there was this choice and it was a sufficiently open market, people would have a choice to engage or not to engage in some of these systems. And also to be able to have that agency over how they care for the common living waters in countries. And if we want to characterise this governance frame and the science policy interface, I think we could call it sort of a coordinated decentralisation or polycentric governance system with controls on monopolisation and markets and distributed ownership and responsibility. So that's a more optimistic scenario, but if I take similar drivers for a second scenario, I can also imagine a 2050 where the even scarcer prime land and water and value obtained with it will only go to those with the money and the convening power, including for hire research, dominant partnerships with industry, potentially globally powerful stakeholders or stockholders. And here I think the modus operandi will likely be concentration of power, control of data, infrastructure, water, land, policy support systems, and personal behaviour through incentives. And we see these already in certain parts of our systems. So the choices over what systems we may physically implant into ourselves, into our homes, our farms, our workplaces and environments, and the power over those incentive systems that shape our responses may be limited. And this is kind of like many of our credit systems today. We enter into this system and then we are more or less controlled through those incentive systems. So although such a scenario may still have stated goals of equality of service and that strong government oversight is possible, it could be likely that many of those community values and aspirations are still sidelined with the continued ecological or cultural destruction, as the objectives of such incentive systems will likely be set by those who have particular interests that may not align with the diversity of those across the basin. So I suppose in conclusion, I think my challenge or our challenge is really to figure out how are we going to navigate towards those more preferred scenarios and think about the science policy interface today so that in 2050 we have one that serves sort of the greater good. And how we think carefully about our investment, our governance structures and infrastructures, including for automation and how these are concentrating or distributing power. I think we also need to think about what limits and protections we may need to put in place for different individuals, communities, governments, research organisations, businesses, media organisations and environments to ensure that each of these has sufficient autonomy and agency over their lives and own futures, both in and beyond 2050. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Catherine, from that very futuristic view. What I'll do now is just call on the panel for any further comments, having heard each other's talks and or questions to them before we might pose some questions to you. Does anyone on the panel like to? Yes, please, Deborah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was really interested with Philip's notion that hope that we'll be over the water wars. And what that brought to my mind was the old drought-proofing the continent sort of folklore. And we'll all probably remember, I think it was John Williams who said, you know, the critical need isn't to drought-proof the land. That's impossible. What we need to do is myth-proof Australians. And when are we actually going to really accept Australia's environment the way it is? And it seems every time we get a drought, it gets portrayed as a disaster, and as if it's something entirely expected. And we have the rhetoric, and it's in lots of policy documents, that drought is a way of life, a risk to be managed. But every time there's a drought, it keeps being, you know, this disaster. And I'm wondering, you know, when are we going to get that through that particular one, because it's very connected to water availability and use.
Are there any further thoughts from the panel on that particular aspect, or any other aspect?
I might throw it over to Paul in a minute and just be rather cheeky, but I think one of the interesting things around drought and the way that we've perceived this issue in Australia is that many of our models and prediction systems are still based on averages. I'm not sure how quickly we're moving towards considering that, in fact, average doesn't really exist in Australia. We have different modes, but average is typically not one of them. So, you know, how can our systems and our modelling structures be set up in a really different way so that we recognise, as I think we're starting to, now we're in La Nina, previously we're in El Nino, to give that kind of information so that people kind of have a knowledge of what they're expecting. Paul, did you want to add to that? Because you're probably close.
Yes, sure. I think there's been a substantial improvement in the knowledge and understanding in the community of these kind of big scale climate drivers of the Indian Ocean Dipole, El Nino, La Nina. We now have pretty good measurements of these over the last couple of decades, and how the soil moisture dries out and then the groundwater is depleted during the millennium drought, how quickly it recovered in 2010, 2011. You're absolutely right that the average doesn't really tell you anything. It's we're in this state or that state or that state. And I think there's a very healthy recognition of that now in just the general community in Australia.
Tony, it's Philip. I was wondering if I could just comment too. I think Deb makes a really good point. We get a letter or 2 letters a week from people who exhort us to tip more water into the Murray-Darling Basin from the Queensland rivers, or tip it over from the East Coast rivers in New South Wales. And it's just one of those things that I think goes to one of the actual questions that are that's come up on the Q&A about this direct link between analysis, science analysis, applying that to policy and decisions, and eventually you see a change on the ground. It doesn't matter how many studies have been made in relation to those. It doesn't matter what the economic, environmental, social, and other costs are, and all the limitations to why those things won't work. People still believe it, and I think that's one of the things that we've got to contemplate as we move towards 2050. We should have been contemplating it 50 years ago. Is that with the democratisation of information, science, analysis, and opinion, that we actually, it doesn't much matter what the science says much anymore. And in my world, and people can just believe things, and if someone tweets it that they trust, then they'll believe that whatever that tweet says, rather than all the great work that's been done by many of the people that would be on this call. And I think we've got to find a way over the next few years to cut through. How do we deal with that fact that the old model that science drives everything, or that analysis and good quality policy making will get us there at the end. I I reckon that's really one of the fundamental challenges, in addition to all the other things the other panellists have mentioned, getting the community at large to believe it when we're not great at communicating it.
It's absolutely fundamental, Philip. Does anybody else want to follow up on that for a moment? What I might do then, feel free, panellists, to follow up later if you like. What I might do now, I've got some questions from the audience here. So the first one's from Leslie Roma. Are there any lessons we can or should take from the role and fate of the Short-Lived Resource Assessment Commission? Would anyone on the panel like to address that one?
I joined the Resource Assessment Mission at its formulation. I was there when we turned the lights out, Tony, and I thought it was a brilliant concept in that it was independent, had its own budget line, and its logic was to try and bring together all the science and all the research that had been done, in particular on, say, things like forests, to try and bring that to the decision makers. And I really regretted the fact that that was lost, because we no longer have that sort of system within government where you could focus on a particular issue, bring forward the current state of science and come into policy. You could argue that the regional forest agreements, which many people might not like their outcome, but they did in a lot of that policy came out of the work of that Resource Assessment Commission. It took 10 years, but it was a well-informed thing. So people were suddenly, instead of arguing on the facts, they were arguing over what are you going to do about the facts. And I just think that's been a loss. And I think, however, that my observation over the last 10 or 15 years is that those institutions are no matter how well created they are, they're no longer trusted by the community. It's got to be a much more democratic way. You know, I'm forever being told that the MDBA is not transparent, is untrustworthy, doesn't listen to all views, etc., etc. I know that's not true, but I can't do anything about it. It's very hard to do something about that. It goes to one of the other questions on the Q&A.
Perhaps a related question to that might be the whatever happened to the National Water Commission. The Productivity Commission, of course, has picked up a little bit of their roles in the assessment, but the Commission doesn't have an ongoing mandate to build their knowledge and capabilities in water in particular. So there was quite a loss there, is my feeling.
I think Gabrielle has also asked a similar question about restoring trust in government, and sort of Philip and Deb have already spoken to that. I think one of the things that we've seen from some recent examples, if I think about, say, the bushfires and smoke, is that by having quite open platforms of data sharing, people can start to form their own perspectives. And I take Philip's point about being open with data and that we can do that, but I think it is a matter also about being citizen driven in some ways. I think some of the really interesting perspectives in Japan around, you know, individual Geiger counters or whatever it might have been for radiation, you know, there are community pitches that can be developed now with the kinds of sensing technologies we have. And I think that kind of community approach to checking and ensuring that government information is approximately, you know, in the same place is something that can build trust, because when their systems and the government systems both say the same thing, then there's not a lot of space for some of these additional very strange pieces of evidence. And at least that means that you're probably going to get, you know, a good 80% of people believing in the same thing rather than, you know, a very divided collection. So I think thinking about what kind of open data we want, but also the issue about those protections. So there's another one here saying about farmer privacy and how do you manage that level of data. I think one of the conversations that may be useful to have with communities over the next little while is what level of data is reasonable. Are there any concerns about releasing certain types? Because I know, for example, if we think about the urban water situation, releasing smart water data in homes could be quite problematic for all sorts of things like family violence and others. So we really do need to think about what the aggregate level is that's appropriate and that helps our decision-making processes, but that doesn't put people in harm's way.
Thank you. I'm going to try and drag a few questions together here a little bit. There's been a lot of emphasis from the panel on, I guess, more regional involvement of communities in decision making, particularly involvement of First Nations, making them front and centre. It's been a common theme through your talks. How do we represent and empower the smaller players who aren't getting a stronger voice as the bigger groups? That's our First Nations and their aspirations. I guess the non-irrigating farmers, the small towns. Do we need to provide funding to those communities so that they're more empowered? What's the way forward there?
I'm happy to have a little go, and I also see Fed's question here about Indigenous engagement. I think one of the things is that they're not necessarily an either or, so you can have sort of small community support with larger, and this I suppose goes to that idea about competing futures and how we bring them together. For example, I know that there are Indigenous businesses, small Indigenous businesses that are supported by very large multinational corporations who are putting in place, for example, virtual reality supports and education programs for kids to encourage them to engage in questions about water and culture and country. And I think through some of those activities, it doesn't really matter where the funding comes from, as long as it is funding that is for those communities and with those communities. And I think that's probably where we need to look and understand, are there roles for government in communities where that is funding to support them their way, and how those conversations can take place. And this has always been a challenge internationally about how that funding should come. But I think if it's managed by communities, for communities, with very supportive people, and then we still need that coordination capacity, because if we think back to the Murray-Darling Basin many years ago, working just at the local level doesn't function. We have cumulative impacts in other parts. So we still need to be thinking about how to coordinate between those communities and understand how those futures will interact. That's not a very specific answer, but I think they're not necessarily always, they're not easy to disentangle.
Tony, I can have a crack at it too. I can certainly talk about what we're trying to do to engage sort of different communities than the ones that we've currently got. Our traditional mode of operation is to talk to big representative groups, whether they're the Wentworth Group, whether they're the ACF, whether they're National Irrigators Council, what have you. And that's fine when you're talking about the big picture, million square kilometres, but the rate limiting step in the implementation of Basin Plan 1, strange enough, to my mind, it's not a lack of information. That would be nice if we could share it more, as Catherine said, and have it actually trusted. But it's actually the reaction of the communities that are doing the change, not so much the irrigators, because they're in one way or another compensated for 20% of their water being removed. What's slowing it down is the fact that local communities can't see economic, environmental, social, cultural value out of this bigger picture. They support the big picture. Yes, let's get a sustainable basin. They prefer, though, to see that sustainable basin in their community. And that's really, I think, where we've got to start. We've with some investment from the government, we're now having a third of our staff. We've got 70, 80 people out in the regions now, and our information flow is so much richer, and our ability to translate science and knowledge and what have you at a local level is increasing. We've got a hell of a long way to go, but that's one way. I think the other way is in some of the governance structures. So, for example, to really, at the moment, the Basin Plan forces state governments to involve Aboriginal groups and communities and nations in planning, but there's not a word in the Act about their engagement in owning and managing, having a say in the way in which water is used. Appointing someone onto the board of the authority is an Indigenous person is a big first step, and hopefully that'll happen. It's been announced a while ago, but there's a number of things like that. I think where we're going to, on top of better science, better access, new tech, new insights, we need to be able to find a way to translate it to a meaningful level. People don't think basin scale. Very few people think basin scale.
Thank you, Philip. I'll just move a little bit along to another topic. I've got a question from Emmy here about what you think the role is of our science agencies at the interface. She's thinking specifically of AIM, CSIRO and Geoscience Australia. Would anybody like to tackle that one?
Do you mean at the interface of policy? So I guess the role of the agencies is to provide information that policy can be better created for the want of that information. Now, an example for that would be the Digital Earth Australia program at Geoscience Australia, which was discussed in workshops yesterday. It's being used to identify, for example, dams that filled up during a rain event or filled up during an event of an environmental flow when the dam should not have happened. Now, Geoscience Australia, through their Digital Earth Australia, were able to turn around the request from the government agency into information within a matter of days to a week, which then gave the government agency knowledge about where to go out on the ground to actually investigate. This is a water compliance issue, but the science agency provided immediate information that allowed the government agency to then specifically target particular locations within their state, and they were able to ascertain whether there was a water compliance issue or whether it was legitimate crop watering or something like that. So there's a very clear interaction that can go on between the science agencies and the government agencies right on that policy interface.
Thank you, Paul. And I think for me, one of the keys there is to have diversity as well beyond those agencies. I think we're just starting to see universities get together a bit more in terms of engaging together in joint work. You know, the recent water and environment research project funding, program funding, where lots of universities got together. We're hoping the Institute for Water Futures here at ANU will be able to bring together other university partners and organisations, including CSIRO. So I think that will be quite important. And as many people listening will know, that there is a CRC1 basin bid across many universities and agencies, and with a lot of industry funding, which we hope will be successful next year. That would be fantastic. I think now, though, that I'd better have a go at summing up to try and capture the I guess the richness of what's been said, and basically I think let's start with the exchange that must be had with the policy science interface, and these exchanges have been argued by the panel rightly must be open and transparent, where communities, governments, business, researchers work together for overall coordinated benefits, and this will build trust. And in an improved interface, speakers are arguing that diverse views are sought, heard and reflected upon, and with respect. And they're also arguing decision-making will be much more regional, where we have bottom-up active regional communities that are well-funded to have agency. And as we heard in an earlier session this morning, and somewhat today, in lunchtime today, they're nested and well aligned with the higher scales of government. Surely by 2050, and particularly, we will have made major advances in putting our First Nations front and centre. We must do this. That we need to build a narrative around environmental watering and continually making the compelling case, explaining why it matters. And there's been a very heavy focus today on improved understanding of environmental watering needs and its benefits. But also, as Deb has argued, improved information about cultural, social and economic conditions in the basin. We really need to improve our information base there. As Philip argues, it's impossible to know what 2050 will look like, but we must be ready and try to anticipate changes. And that's not just climate, that's also from international trends, what's going on there, which would include trade, as we've recently seen. But it could also include international policies that might impact us, including, carbon credit schemes and things like that, meeting emission targets. Hopefully by then, though, we'll be prepared for climate change, and we'll have connected policies better. So Philip talked a lot about that. At a high level, that's around food, energy and biodiversity, but it's also across different scales. And then, as Catherine said, noting that the social policy aspects are vital, there'll be continuing role for technology and even autonomous decision-making systems, as she's argued. And I guess more generally, there's the ongoing development of a larger range of fit-for-purpose tools, across communities, service communities that range significantly in values, beliefs, and what they want 2050 to look like. Those tools will be needed. So finally, I guess I'd sum up saying in practice, the design, implementation, and/or the assessment of science policy interfaces are going to remain a challenge. There's a definite need for anticipating futures, planning, for innovation in our designs around interfaces, and how about case studies, benchmarking existing interfaces, if you like, as well as building trust at all levels through authentic engagement. So that's my summary for today. I'd like to pass back to the panel for any very final comments before we've closed today. It's looking like you've done very well. I'd like then to thank the panel, Deb, Paul, Philip and Catherine, for contributing generously and expertly today. Please join with me in thanking them. Thank you very much. All the best. Have a good afternoon.